Hi, welcome to the small shed. This week we're looking at how I put the foundations and floor in the shed, and that's coming up next. So using my rubbish drawings as usual, let's just have a quick look at the sort of normal options you get with both a house or any sort of structure for foundations. Now with a house you can either do what is probably the most common way. You take a piece of land and you dig a trench. You fill the bottom with concrete when you get down to a decent finish foundation, and you lay either bricks, blocks or something like that, bring it up to ground level. Looking at it in section there, as I say, you've got the ground level there, you've got some concrete in the bottom of the trench, bricks and blocks going up to ground level, and in the case of a shed you'd then just put your joists across your floor and then you build the shed up off that. That is one option. To get to a decent foundation for a shed, you've probably got to go down quite deep. It leaves you an awful lot of earth to get rid of. You've got to get mixing concrete, and you still run the risk, if you're not down to a decent foundation, of things moving, tree roots kicking things up, all sorts of things that can give you a problem later on. Second option, in a house it would be, or a factory, it would be either piles or bases that you'd have. In a shed all you really need is probably some blocks laid flat on the ground. You'd probably dig them in, one block deep or so to get to a decent foundation, maybe put a bit of gravel or hardcore underneath it and bash it down. Another block on top just to give you a bit of ground clearance, and again put your shed up on top, and that works quite well for a shed. Again, there is the option that things might move around a bit, but it's a valid option that you see quite often. A lot of the American videos that you see for people making sheds, they'll opt for this sort of arrangement. Perhaps the most common in Britain and the UK. If you go for a housing option again, you would dig big trenches and put a single raft of concrete in with reinforcement in it, and that way if there's any subsidence or movement at all, the whole structure will move as one, so that whilst it might tilt slightly it won't actually crack or anything like that. Clearly it's unlikely that you're going to be putting a raft foundation in under a shed, although you might put in a solid concrete slab, which will give you the option. But again, if you're doing that, you're going to need probably 3 or 4 inches of concrete, 3 or 4 inches of hardcore at least, so you've got quite a lot of excavation to do. I think the most common way that folks do it, and certainly the way I've done 75% of the shed area, is just basically dig out a little bit, blind it with some sand or cement or something like that, sand or concrete or loose mortar, dry mix, and lay slabs on it, and that way you're achieving pretty much the same thing. You've got something which will spread the load from the shed into the pads of the slabs, and in section you've just got the slabs, and then you just lay your joists on top. Now for the old small shed, that was exactly what I had. It had moved over the years, there were 1 or 2 bumpy bits, but I wasn't going to disturb it, because once it's settled and it's in its right place, it's unlikely to move a lot after that. So although it was slightly out of level, I've worked on that as my foundation base. So with the original first shed, that was situated on slabs next to a paved area and a garden area. and when that was removed, it left me an area that had got a stable base, slabbed. They'd moved very slightly and were undulating here and there, which was something I'd have to correct, but at least it gave me a solid foundation that it wasn't really worth disturbing. So I went out and bought 3 10-foot 4x4 posts, and inside the car are another 6, I think, 8-foots for the cross rails, and I made those up with halved joints, screwed them together, and that gave me effectively like a raft that the whole thing would sit on the ground. You can see the slight differences in level, but it gave me a guide as to where I was going to go in the garden and have to remove plants and soil under there, and that left me a step of about 6 inches down that would need to be dealt with. Now, I could have filled it up with concrete or bricked it up, but as it was, I went down to a reasonably decent foundation with some slabs and used decking risers. The one side of the base is sitting on the existing pathway anyway, so that gave me a reasonably good solid foundation. I then put the whole thing onto a heavy duty damp-proof membrane, packed it up at all the intermediate positions with tiles to get all the levels right, and then to make sure nothing moved and none of the tiles slipped out or anything with vibration, I put some foam underneath, and that kept everything solid, rigid. Wrapped the damp proof over the top of the 4x4 timbers, probably a bit overkill. Round the outside edge, you'll see later on, they're needed because they provide a base for the floor, but the intermediate cross rails could have been a 4x2, I would have thought, but again, I wanted something solid and rigid that would act almost as one solid piece of timber when it was all screwed together. The lower end, you can see the floor is actually raised up on those decking risers, and the only problem I had was that it was gathering rainwater every time it rained, and I had to keep bailing it out. The wall panels, you can see laying down flat there, have got a bottom timber which sits on top of that outer rail of foundation, and that allows it to drip down onto the ground outside, and it gives me effectively a weather-tight seal all the way around the edge. Once the panels are erected, you can see that they sit on that base. The outer cladding goes down in front of it, and there's a ledge inside which will be used later on for the plywood to sit on. And then what that did was allow me to put the walls up, put a temporary roof on, and the whole structure was then watertight without having to worry about the flooring itself. The reason I had these 4-inch timbers on the outside was so that I could sit the floor on all the way around the outer perimeter, and it did mean that I could just get on with doing the insulation in the dry. It was not very good weather when I was putting the shed up, so I was able to get on with all sorts of other jobs inside while that was going on outside, and not having a problem. So that was the reasoning behind doing it that way round. It's probably not what most people do. They put a foundation in, they put a base down, and then they build the walls off that base. Nothing wrong with that, but what this does mean is that I can actually lift the floor if I want to. If there's any problem with levelling or anything, I can actually pull the insulation up and get at the foundations and re-level if I ever had to. And not something I'm looking forward to doing, or I hope I have to do, but it is a possibility. And again, it's very easy then, 2.5 sheets of plywood cut. The 8-foot width was fine anyway, because it was designed to be a width of a plywood sheet. So it was 2.5 sheets of plywood down on the floor, and that gave me a solid base to work on. And again, there was no worry about it being affected by the rain or anything while I was doing it, because it's going down in the dry, in the warm, and it gave me a good solid base. On top of that, as a sacrificial covering, I've actually put some laminate flooring on a foam backing. May seem a bit too much for a workshop, but actually it's ideal. It cost me about £5 a box, and I needed 3 boxes, I think. But it's given me a sacrificial base that if I drop things on the floor it doesn't damage anything other than the laminate, and I can, by removing a skirting board, take the whole thing out and replace it in 24 hours effectively. So that's how I did the foundations and the floor. Next week I'll be looking at the doors, windows, and I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.